Slowly, and with his mind still hazy, James was lulled awake by the constant, soft beeping of the heart rate monitor he was connected to. His eyelids fluttered as he tried to open them, and got immediately blinded by the harsh lights right above him. Somehow, this was oddly familiar. The more he came to, the more of his senses sprung back into action. The air was clinical and stale, and carried the distinct smell of disinfectant and lemon-scented cleaning supplies. His mouth tasted of mint and alcohol, as if it had been rinsed out with strong mouthwash. And finally, he felt a soft pressure on his chest. Given that there was no pain, he expected that his nociceptors were still being muted by some sort of substance, but the pressure was still there. Slowly but surely, his retinas stopped burning every time he so much as slightly opened his eyes, and he began to actually see again. All the while, the heart rate monitor beeped on, unperturbed by him waking up, and there were other sounds as well, faint but constant. Breathing. The room was so quiet that he could actually hear breathing around him, and not just his own. Carefully, he finally managed to fully open his eyes, seeing the off-white ceiling above his head and the lamp giving off that cold, artificial light that so incessantly tried to blind him. Next, he carefully started to flex some of his muscles, gauging how much control he had over them already. His head lifted no problem, his toes seemed to bend just fine, and he could flex both his calves and thigh muscles. Satisfied with that, he completely lifted his head to investigate that weight on his chest, before he would try to move his shoulders or arms. And his eyes fell onto a head of dark hair with large ears, laying on top of two crossed, striped arms, a recumbent on his chest, trapping his left arm. A tingling spread slowly through his entire body as his heart skipped a beat, and his body started to move on its own. Before he even knew it, he had lifted his right arm, bringing it out from underneath the blanket and reaching for Sheeta's head, if only to make sure that she was actually real, and not some illusion brought by his pain medication. However, just before his hand had reached her, he stopped himself, the tips of his fingers hovering just centimeters away from her hair. His right hand followed his command to the letter, and remained perfectly still while waiting for his next orders, not so much as trembling while it held his position. He pulled it back slightly, bringing the hand up in front of his face and studying the appendage intently. At the first glance, it looked just like a hand, if one didn't look too closely. However, the longer he looked, the more he noticed something was missing. Profile. The hand was just too smooth. The lines on it weren't deep enough, more hinted at in their form than actually there. And of course, it was missing all of his scars. It gave him a strange feeling. He looked at the synthetic appendage for a second longer before his eyes lowered back down onto Shida, and he could feel his heart fall ever so slightly. "Now that you're awake, be so good and call the doctor over. He's going to want to check on you." A kind, firm, and very familiar voice suddenly rang out from the other side of the room, and James's gaze snapped up and around to look for its source. There should be one of those pager thingies next to you somewhere. James's eyes immediately zeroed in on the dark figure, sitting in a white, comfortable-looking armchair right across from where his bed was located in the room, and apparently reading something on her phone. He was quite glad that he had gotten all of the crying out of the way yesterday, so that he could now fully concentrate on the warm, fuzzy feeling that started in his guts and spread all the way to his very fingertips, lulling him into a sense of gentle comfort. For a moment, Nia had played the cold, unmoved person really well, barely even acknowledging that he had looked at her and keeping her eyes glued to the screen. However, neither could nor did she want to keep up her effort very long, and soon she dropped her phone aside and shot up from her seat, hurrying through the room, getting faster with each step she took. Before James could even manage to get into a better position, she already threw herself over him, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck and apparently determined to squeeze the life out of him in her tackle hug. James was more than up for that, though, and he comfortably placed his arm on the back of her head, while she buried her face in his shoulder, her warm breast spreading over his skin as she did so. Nia's bold jump at him had two additional effects. One was that it had been more than enough to wake up Shida, whose head shot up in surprise as her clearly tired mind tried to process what was happening. The other was that apparently, Nia's rough hug had somehow managed to dislodge whatever electrode was currently connecting James to the monitor next to him, which now loudly sounded the alarm after detecting no coherent heart rate anymore. This woke Shida up even more, and finally she seemed to become coherent enough to fully realize what was going on. Her glistening yellow eyes stared wildly at James's face. While still gently stroking the back of Nia's head, James looked back at Shida, giving her a warm smile, not quite sure what to say. And before he knew it, he had another tackle in his hand, feeling himself be rocked to the side as Shida heavily impacted him. Somehow, the two women managed to not get in each other's way as both slung their arms around him, and James couldn't help but laugh as he tried to deal with the overwhelming assault of affection. Suddenly, the door flew open, and into the room stormed a group of medical professionals, most likely summoned by the alarm from the device besides James, looking quite surprised at the picture they found in front of them as soon as they realised that there was no actual medical emergency. Shida almost immediately burst away from James again, looking pretty sheepish while trying to avoid the gazes of the nurses and doctors that had arrived in the room. Nia, on the other hand, did not care at all, and clung to her brother like a monkey baby to his mother, until someone literally tapped her on the shoulder and asked her to make space so the personnel could turn off the loud alarm that still filled the room, and unhook any remaining equipment that was still connected to James's body, now that he had awoken without problems. The whole process took less than a minute, and with some bemused and encouraging looks back at James, most of the medical personnel cleared out of the room again, leaving behind a single man that James recognised as the doctor he had met during his checkups and the pre-op talk he had gotten that morning, although admittedly James had already forgotten his name again. He was a short but gangly man with slowly greying hair that clearly used to be black, and dark bags under his eyes that rivaled James's own. From the looks of him, he was pretty severely underweight, which wasn't helped by the white coat he wore that was clearly 1 or 2 sizes too large for him, which made it look like he had stolen it from a much larger doctor. "How is it going, Mr. Aldwin?" he asked in a polite, but also hoarse and tired voice. "I hope we didn't come at an inopportune moment." From his periphery, James noticed Shida seemingly trying to melt into the shadows, doing anything to not have her presence acknowledged by the doctor. "Not at all," James replied, a little bit embarrassed that he caused a false alarm in the medical ward, but still feeling too warm and fuzzy to actually fuss about it. "I basically just woke up." The doctor nodded. "The operation went very well from our side. Any pain or uncomfortable feeling?" he professionally inquired further. James searched into himself for a moment for anything he might have overlooked in the heat of the moment, but no, he was fine. "None at all," he truthfully answered, and the doctor nodded again. "That's good," the husky man said. "Still, let's do some quick tests to make sure everything is still working as intended." The next few minutes were spent with the doctor measuring James's blood pressure, and having James apply pressure with his naturally occurring fingers, toes, hands, and feet, as well as a testing of James's reflexes. All pretty standard stuff to make sure no nerve damage had occurred at any point. Once the doctor was satisfied with that, they finally got to the more interesting part of the thing the operation had been about in the first place, the newly installed robotic arm. "Well, it seems that you can move it just fine. Are you feeling any delays or resistance from it?" the doctor asked, inspecting the appendage in his hand for a moment, before allowing James to lift it on his own and move it around for a bit. It moved without problem. Just based on feeling, he couldn't even tell the difference between it and his old arm, although it had admittedly been a while since he knew what his old arm had felt like. Still, he had a deep-seated, gut feeling that something was off. But since he couldn't actually name anything that was wrong, he still replied, "No, it moves just fine." The doctor brought his fingers to his face ponderingly, but didn't actually touch it, hovering it a finger's width away from his face instead. "Okay, then let's see about the range of motion. Don't be surprised if it is a bit larger than what you're used to, and don't be afraid to push your boundaries," he ordered, and interestedly focused on the robotic limb. James did as he was told and started to bend and flex the limb in every which way, seeing how far it would allow him to twist and turn it. It was admittedly a weird feeling to not be met with actual pain or the feeling of strain once he overshot his limits, when the arm instead just stopped dead and merely refused to turn any further, instead of signaling to his brain that he should go back or at least ease up on the pressure. Out of the corner of his vision, he had noticed Shida creeping closer and closer to him for a while, apparently interested in the process. And now, as he was just in the process of twisting the arm around itself, seeing if it would let him a full turn of his hand, or maybe even more, he saw her visibly shudder. Still, while the arm moved fine and didn't seem to restrict his movement in any way, he was almost disappointed that it barely allowed for any more movement than his biological one had done. Apparently it was quite a faithful recreation of what a human arm should be capable of, in terms of range of motion. After a while, it seemed that the doctor was satisfied yet again. "Well, it all looks fine to me so far," he concluded with an acknowledging nod. "We're of course going to have to keep an eye on it for the upcoming days and perform some tests later. Also, let us know immediately if any problems come up. For now, it all looks fine, but you should know that the pain sensors in your new arm are mostly muted, and judging its strength can be difficult at first, so make sure to get enough practice in before you try anything delicate." James nodded silently, honestly just waiting for the man to leave at this point, even if that was a bit rude. "For now, I'll inform the Admiral that you're awake. In the meantime, try not to overdo it," the doctor continued, and glanced towards Shida and Nia for a moment, before he turned to leave the room. "Let us know if you need anything." "Will do," James replied, hoping that would prompt the man to leave the room quicker. Luckily, The doctor didn't decide to overstay his welcome, and left with calm yet swift steps, shutting the door behind him with a soft click, and leaving behind an awkward silence for a few seconds, as nobody quite knew what to say after their first emotional outburst had been interrupted earlier, which had seemingly taken the wind out of their sails. The person finally able to break through the awkwardness was Nia, as she scooted up back to James's right side and grabbed his new arm, picking it up and inspecting it for herself for a moment. "So, metal arm, huh?" she said, easing James back into a conversation instead of starting with the full-on sappiness that surely was to come. "Yeah," James replied, great with words as always. Then he realized once again why there was a problem, which had sort of been dipping in and out of his consciousness ever since he had woken up, as he had so far not had the opportunity to really focus on it. Sheepishly, his eyes wandered over towards Shida, who had suddenly reappeared on the other side of his bed and looked over at Nia, who was still holding the robotic appendage. "It looks pretty real," Shida finally said, opening her mouth for the first time since James had woken up, clearly putting on a brave face for him despite not seeming all too comfortable with the limb replacement. James smiled awkwardly. "It does, doesn't it?" he replied, lifting the arm out of Nia's hand to inspect it himself once again. However, just like Shida, he was lying. It didn't look real. It looked uncanny. It looked like an arm by the broadest definition, but nothing like his arm. It was too smooth, too unblemished, like a blank canvas. Clearly whoever designed the appendage and the artificial skin had gone through great lengths to make it look convincing, and James appreciated the effort, but to him, it looked more like the arm of a little kid than his own. It lacked the scars, the scratches, the damage the sun had done to his tissue over the years, the creases and wrinkles left behind by constantly repeated motion. It just showed no signs of the years of life that he had, well, lived, as if a part of his past had been erased. However, he gritted his teeth against the thought. He would just have to get used to it, he was sure. "You didn't look like you enjoyed it either, though," James now added to his previous statement directed to Shida, remembering her shuddering and feeling it may be a way to bridge the gap in the conversation. Shida seemed flustered, her ears bending downwards slightly as she recoiled slightly at the accusation. "It's not that, it's..." She started her defense, but stopped in the middle of it to sigh and take a deep breath, before she started again, going for a different angle and mumbling under her breath. "Arms just aren't supposed to bend that way, okay?" James and Nia exchanged a surprised glance. "You mean like this?" James asked, and in what was admittedly a not too well thought out gesture, he repeated the movement from earlier, twisting the arm around itself until the palm of his hand pointing upwards in the same direction as it did when he started the turning. Just as she had before, Shida shuddered at the sight, and James could see her hair start to stand up. "Yeah, that," she said, averting her gaze. "Would you stop that?" James stopped, bringing the arm back into a normal position and chuckled awkwardly. "Well, I'm not sure how to say this, but that actually isn't a feature of the mechanical arm," he admitted bashfully, and as if to prove what he had just said, he repeated the motion once again, this time with his organic left arm. "See? All right, I get it," Shida said in a serious manner, and only briefly glanced at James's demonstration. Apparently Amir's arms just weren't quite as bendy as human ones, which was surprising given the feline's usual flexibility. Nia giggled at Shida's flustered behaviour, but despite James being the one to cause it, he honestly felt bad. Making sure to keep the robotic arm firmly on his right side, he reached out to Shida with his left arm, wrapping it around her shoulder and pulling her in tightly. Immediately, Shida showed that she wasn't actually mad at him, and she started purring right away, and also wrapped her arms around him. The deep, throaty noise filled the entire room, and sent vibrations through James's chest that felt oddly comforting. "I missed you so much," James finally admitted, dropping all pretenses, and just holding her as tight as he could. He could even feel his eyes tearing up again, although luckily he wasn't full-on crying this time. "I'm so glad you're finally safe," Shida replied, and although Mia couldn't cry, it almost sounded like she was sobbing anyway. Behind him, James could hear Nia make a touch sound, and she suddenly watched the two finally properly reuniting with each other. After holding each other for what was probably an uncomfortable amount of time for any other situation, they finally let go again, and Shida slowly slipped back into her previous position of sitting on the side of his bed. Although, despite him knowing that she didn't like it, James couldn't help but press a kiss onto her face, which Shida, to her credit, endured without any signs of discomfort. "I'm glad you're safe as well," James said, rubbing the weak stream of tears off his face with the back of his new hand. I thought... He didn't finish the sentence, and he likely didn't need to. Shida just suddenly reached for his hand, taking it tightly into her own. James also felt a hand on his back, as Nia now tried to comfort him as well. "You got them out fine, and you got out fine yourself, that's all that matters now," she encourages him, with continued pats on his back. James nodded and smiled at his sister, also pulling her into another hug. Sorry for worrying you, he said. There, big guy, she replied. I never doubted you for a second. Obviously she was lying, but that didn't matter. The hug didn't last quite as long as the one with Shida, but the siblings had been through a lot together, and were therefore used to hard times. They knew they had each other's backs. Besides, if James had understood correctly what the doctor had said, he probably wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, so he had plenty of time to be sappy with his sister, probably when his girlfriend wasn't around. The same was true the other way around, of course. He had plenty to say to Shida once they were alone. As soon as he had peeled back from Nia, the next bit of awkward silence set in. But suddenly, James realised something. There was not smell in his nose. Have you two been using the same shampoo? He asked straight out, looking back and forth between the women, noticing that they had smelled exactly alike. Oh yeah, I've been lending Shida mine to get her hair situation under control, Nia immediately replied. It was a catastrophe when she first got here. Nobody ever taught that girl anything about self-care, apparently. I'm right here, you know, Shida defensively replied, reaching for her hair as if she needed to hold on to it after that insult. Now that James looked at it, her hair really was different. At least he thought it was. It had been a while after all. It seemed softer. Tell me I'm wrong, though. Nia immediately dug further into Shida, and James looked at her in slight shock. That usually wasn't Nia's style. Well, unless... So, I take it you two have gotten to know each other quite well, huh? He ventured to guess, seeing the two women glare at each other with more playful than angry looks. Nia then turned her eyes towards James with a slight groan. Well, duh, she said, and gave James her typical you're an idiot look that he was all too familiar with. Like I'm going to have my possible sister-in-law around and not get to know her. Possible sister-in-law? There was quite the tune she had going on there when James compared it to the way she spoke about the last girlfriend he had had. Well, at least it seemed like Shida had her approval, which gave her some serious bonus points, even if they weren't necessary. Soon after, the door to the room suddenly swung wide open again. Everybody get your pants on, because we're barging in, Admiral flamboyantly yelled out, entering the room in big strides while carrying a large tray in front of his chest. And he was in interesting company. Admiral! Nia immediately and excitedly yelled out, almost jumping up from her seat to hurry and greet the arriving lieutenant. Admiral quickly swung around and carefully bounced the tray away from his body so that Nia would neither run straight into it, nor knock it out of his hands as she eagerly gave him a quick hug. Hey, Nia, he quickly greeted back, trying to get into a position in which he could easily accept the hug without losing his balance. Long time no see. Whoa, careful with this. While those two were busy, another new arrival quickly pushed themselves past the humans. Curi! James exclaimed surprisedly, and his first thoughts were of one thing only. Are you all right in the gravity here? Curi wasn't a Deathworlder after all, and even he could still feel the super high gravity pull on him at that very moment, despite having grown up in it. Curi's synthetic eyes stared back at James for some time, without a word out of them. Then they quickly scuttled over to his bedside, taking up the empty space that Nia had left behind when she went to greet Admiral. Hello, James, the cyborg finally said. My body is more than fine with heightened gravity, as only my inner organs need to be supplied with blood. Right, James replied, unsure what to say to that. Curi just stared at him, and James was unsure if they didn't know what to say or just didn't have anything to say. It's very good to see you again, James said, wanting to get at least out what he felt. And I'm glad you're okay. How have the other humans treated you? Curi stared, unmoving for a few moments longer, which was something James should probably be used to by now. Thank you, James, was what they finally said. Thank you for caring. Thank you for all. Oh, his poor heart. James knew Curi wasn't a hugger, so he just replied, Of course, Curi. Then he felt like he would well up again if he didn't lighten the mood right that instant, so in a stroke of what clearly was true genius and not the very obvious thing to do, he lifted his new arm replacement, showing it off to his now fellow cyborg, and now stating, Look, robot arm. Looks pretty real, doesn't it? He could think of little more to say than to just parrot what Shida said about it earlier, as he was still trying to make up his mind about his opinion of his new limb. Indeed, Curi replied thoughtfully and studied the limb. However, somehow, they radiated the same uncertainty that James felt about the limb, which was weird because he had expected them to be ecstatic. Although it could very well be that they were just reminded about the circumstances under which James had gained the replacements, which probably started their enthusiasm quite a bit. Breakfast in bed for our man of the day because you must be starving. Admiral suddenly injected himself into the moment, after either having managed to get past Nia for the moment, or her being done with him for now, and he boisterously bore the tray he was carrying down onto James's legs. Bon appetit. And even though he hadn't quite realised it until now, James was actually very hungry, after not having eaten at all yesterday. Also, what Admiral had brought him there did smell really good, although upon closer inspection it seemed to be just pan-fried meat and cooked vegetables, which is about on par with Admir's usual cooking skills. Still, simple didn't mean bad, so after a quick "thank you very much," James began to eagerly dig in. Almost immediately, he also noticed Shida slowly starting to reach for his plate to snatch something off of it, and he got ready to shoo her away should she try to pick one of the vegetables. However, she seemed to be gunning for the meat, which should have been fine for her to eat, so he let her do so without a comment. However, as soon as he stuck a piece of meat into his mouth himself, he had to pause for a moment, because the taste was extremely familiar. "That's my recipe," he said, almost stunned and with his mouth still full, which earned him a disapproving look from his sister, who had returned together with Admiral and positioned herself next to Curi, sitting back down on his bedside, while Admiral had joined Shida on the other side of the bed, and looked quite shocked that she had dared to steal food from someone on his sickbed. "Recipe?" Shida asked, looking at the piece of meat with a bite taken out of it in her own hand, and apparently wondering what sort of recipe would be involved in frying a piece of meat. Admiral moved his attention away from the feline and towards James, replying, "Yeah, well, I thought after all that time far from home, maybe you'd like something familiar for once, so I had the people down in the labs whip it up for you while we're on our way here." James looked down at his plate, on which lay more pieces of meat that had apparently been cloned specifically for him, according to a composition he had made up for a school project years ago. "Thank you," he said, swallowing heavily and prodding at another piece of meat with his fork. "The lab," Shida repeated for a second and looked at the meat once again, with foreboding on her face. "What are we actually eating here?" "Well, meat," Admiral said, clearly missing the point of the question and shrugging his shoulders dismissively. However, James had understood better and clarified sheepishly, "Lab-cloned meat, actually, specifically designed for consumption, by me in this case." Shida seemed to freeze slightly, as she apparently contemplated her life's choices while thinking about what she had just swallowed. "This place is going to be the death of me," she finally said, and shook her head with her eyes closed. "You seriously can't even just eat normal meat?" "I don't think they even have that on board," James admitted with a conciliatory look at Shida, who seemed to be having a dark realization at that time. "Wait, you've been eating lab-grown meat just fine so far. What's the problem with it now?" Neo innocently inquired, apparently not quite caught on to what was happening yet. Shida just grabbed out and grabbed James's arm, leaning in closer towards him. "James," she said, with clearly paid-up desperation in her voice, "please don't tell me that I've been unknowingly eating meat that was grown in a laboratory for the past month or so without realizing it." James awkwardly smiled back at her and said, "I don't think you need me to tell you now." Shida let go of his arm again and let her gaze sink downward, remaining quiet for a few seconds before announcing, "Okay, change the topic, now." Which caused Admiral to loudly snort before he burst into a snicker, which earned him a venomous glare from Shida. Nia, apparently following Shida's orders to change the topic, studied the two for a moment, before she leaned in a bit closer to James and whispered in a way that was clearly meant to be loud enough to still be heard by everyone. "You know, James, now that I see those two next to each other, I have to say, you kind of have a type." James looked at her confusedly before turning his head to study Shida and Admiral sitting next to each other. He saw that dark hair, good tan, athletic build, and subtropical temper would indeed have been a good description for both. So obviously he replied, "I have no idea what you're talking about." Shida and Admiral interestedly turned to look and gave each other a once-over with their eyes. It was only now that James realized that those two had most likely not been introduced to each other yet, and of course neither of them had said anything about it. Maybe he really did have a type. By the way, Shida, this is Admiral," he started and pointed at the man, before putting his finger back and pointing at Shida instead and adding, "And Admiral, this is Shida." His current and ex-partner respectively looked at each other once more. "So, you and James have been," Shida started, and Admiral didn't even let her finish the question before he replied, "Yep, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was love at first sight." He dreamily leaned back as if he was diving into memories. However, James remembered the events quite differently and immediately called him out on it, saying, bullshit?" Admiral snapped back up, looking at James in slight surprise. "Wasn't it?" he asked, and it almost seemed like he was seriously confused and not just trying to bullshit him. "No," James replied bemusedly. "I wondered what the hell Admiral was thinking about. We didn't even talk to each other for the first month or so of training. Then we were pulled aside for training in doubles. You asked me about my interests, and I told you I was into natural sciences. You asked if that included chemistry, and when I said yes, you pestered me about mixing stink bombs and laxatives, and you never left me alone again after." Admiral stared for a few moments, as he had apparently romanticized the memory of their budding relationship a bit. However, finally, his face turned smug, and he pointed at James with a single finger, saying, But you fell for me eventually. James sighed, mostly because he couldn't even deny that. True enough, he mumbled with a shrug, and Emma seemed quite happy with that perceived victory, although the two had obviously long since broken up again, and their time together was nothing but a memory now. Not perturbed in the slightest, Admiral then turned to Sheeta again. So, how did you two meet? He asked interestedly. She cut open my arm. I cut open his arm, James and Sheeta replied synchronously, and James brought up his arm to show off the scar that was left of his and Sheeta's first encounter back in the GES. Kinky, Abby commented, with a quick look at the 5 scratch marks. I can see how you two ended up together. He then turned to Nia with an impish look. But I'm still your favourite, right? Nia huffed disapprovingly and sharply looked back at him. We'll see about that, she said harshly, and Admir immediately reached for his heart in faint shock and horror. I knew I couldn't compete with a space cat, he said melodramatically, and made a fainting motion. Why would it be a competition if you already lost years ago? James commented, laying into him further, knowing that his distraught behaviour was nothing but show. Their breakup had been mutual, and both of them were long over it. Well, ouch, Admir replied with a dry chuckle. You got me there. By now, James had pretty much finished his meal, and it had been a long time since he had enjoyed eating this much. Recently, it had felt more like a chore, no matter how it tasted. But this was nice, despite its simplicity. Admin noticed he was putting down his cutlery, and he started to push himself up to his feet. So, are you actually allowed to get up? He asked James. His light-hearted tone shifted ever so slightly. James shrugged. I wasn't told not to get up, so I guess, he replied, looking at Abby unsurely. Abby nodded. Then if you're done, the Admiral wants to talk to you again, he informed James. Of course, James had already expected something like this, after they had ended their conversation on the previous day early. Still, he couldn't help but push back at least a little bit, saying, In that case, I think you should actually stay in bed. You never know, after all. Admir smirked. However, Nia shook her head slowly and softly appealed to James. James, please. Immediately, James raised his hand, calming her down. I know, he said, conciliatorily. Don't worry, I'll go. Well, actually, you all can come too if you want, Abby then informed them, speaking to the entirety of the group. She's going to want to talk to each one of you as well. You'll probably have to wait a bit until she's done with James, but maybe you'll get to watch the fireworks. Fireworks? She'd asked and looked confused. You'll see, Nia sighed defeatedly, and got up from her chair. We'll wait outside so you can get dressed. However, James didn't wait for them to leave. Not like there's anything any of you haven't seen before, he mumbled, and walked over to where a neat stack of clothes was prepared for him on a small table. Well, except for Curi, but I doubt they care. Do you, Curi? I would like to talk to the person responsible for your arm, they said, speaking both in no uncertain terms and completely ignoring his question. If the Admiral wishes to speak to me, I will prepare to be called once she has time for me. James shrugged. I'm sure the doctor is around here somewhere, he said, while he started to change out of his hospital gown and into proper clothing, even if it was a military uniform for now. But don't disturb him if he has to work. I'll be sure to keep that in mind, Curi said, before they left the room, surprisingly single-mindedly. James had no idea what that was about, but clearly something was on Curi's mind that he didn't understand. Nia had been the only one to tastefully turn around while James changed, and so she was the last one to realise that he was done once she and Admir began moving. Together as a group, they crossed what felt like big parts of the ship, but was in actuality just a small area on their way towards his mother's office. James made note of how much easier it was to move already, although it remained quite taxing overall. Why do you think she wants to talk to me? She'd whispered to James while they were on their way. The Admiral, I mean. James shrugged. You're a key witness in this whole incident. You're an off-worlder on her ship. You have first-hand insights into the communal military. You're my girlfriend. You'll probably need new living arrangements. He listed off just the things he could count on one hand at that moment. Quite frankly, I can think of a lot of reasons. Why would me being your girlfriend matter? She'd asked confusedly, apparently seeing that point as the odd one out among the listed reasons. James looked at her surprisingly. Has no one told you that yet? He asked and glanced over at Nia, who surely had not left out such vital information by accident. Tell me what? She'd asked, with a serious look at James. James paused awkwardly, before explaining. The Admiral might be my mother. What? She'd loudly exclaimed, and James had to spend some time explaining the situation to her, while they crossed the last bit of way towards their destination. Since all she knew about James's mother was that the two weren't on good terms, she didn't take it too well at first. Great. No, I'm not nervous at all, she'd mumbled, once they had reached the simple door leading right into the lion's den. Well, you'll have some time to calm down, Admiral teasingly encouraged her, before turning towards James with an excusatory expression. Your boyfriend's first on the chopping block. James briefly squeezed Sheeta's hand, before turning and walking towards the door at a brisk pace, loudly banging against it with his new right arm, that had seemingly immediately taken back over the function as dominant hand as soon as it became available once more. Of course, his mother immediately invited him in, as he stepped back into the now familiar office. His mother gestured towards the chair in front of her with a smile on her face, looking as if she had very much awaited him. How are you feeling? She asked politely, while James let himself sink into the chair across from her. Fine, James replied briefly. How's the new arm? His mother continued, folding her hands with her elbows on the desk. It's fine, James repeated himself with a sigh, and leaned back in the chair. My, what are we talking to today? His mother commented, exasperated, and puckered her lips in a disappointed way. James didn't dignify that statement with a reply, and instead just looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to drop the act. His mother sighed. You know, it hurts if you're always so dismissive as soon as I try to be nice to you, she stated, and extensively stretched her arms for a moment. Whatever you say, James replied, feeling that actions would speak louder than words in that regard. He was sure that she'd live. Finally, his mother sat up straight in her seat, and looked him directly in the eyes. You know why you're here? She asked him, and James took a deep breath. I can imagine some things, but honestly I'm not sure, he replied, feeling that she likely hadn't just decided the person he talked to him to take his testimony. And already, his mother's aura and demeanour told him that, whatever was to come, it likely wouldn't be pleasant.